Today's story is one that reminds us just how quickly glory can turn into tragedy in the world of motorsport. On this day in 1959, just months after becoming Britain's first Formula One world champion, Mike Hawthorn's life was devastatingly cut short on a rain-soaked road in Surrey. We often talk about the golden era of F1, when everything seemed more raw and romantic. Well, Mike Hawthorn embodied that spirit perfectly. Picture this: a tall, dashing figure with his trademark bow tie, who'd race cars at breakneck speeds and then celebrate with a bottle of champagne at his tourist trophy pub in Farnham. He wasn't just Britain's first world champion, he was the kind of character that made F1 feel like an adventure rather than just a sport. In an era where Ferrari was still run by the old man himself, Enzo Ferrari, and the cars were more like beautiful death traps than the high-tech machines we see today. Let me paint you a picture of what Formula One was like back in 1958. This wasn't the modern F1 with safety cars and halo devices. Racing in the 50s was raw, dangerous, and had this unmistakable romanticism about it. Drivers weren't just athletes, they were daredevils who'd race on Sunday and might not make it to Monday. Hawthorn was racing in an era where Ferrari was still run by the old man himself, Enzo Ferrari, and the cars were more like beautiful death traps than the high-tech machines we see today. The championship fight that year was incredibly close, coming down to a single point between Hawthorn and Sterling Moss. And get this, in Morocco, during the final race, Moss actually helped argue against a penalty for Hawthorn that could have cost him the title. Can you imagine that happening today? It was one of the most gentlemanly title battles you'll ever hear about. But 1958 was also a brutal year for Formula One. Hawthorn had lost his close friend and Ferrari teammate Peter Collins at the German Grand Prix, and Luigi Musso had died earlier that season at Reims. These weren't just colleagues. In those days, drivers formed incredibly tight bonds because they all knew the risks they were taking every time they climbed into the cockpit. Maybe that's why, at just 29 and fresh off becoming world champion, Hawthorn decided to call it quits. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do, become Britain's first world champion, and perhaps he felt it was time to step away while he was on top. He had plans to focus on his family's garage business and his tourist trophy pub in Farnham, a proper English gentleman's retirement if there ever was one. But fate had other plans. On that wet January morning, while driving his Jaguar Mark I along the A3 Guildford bypass, a road he probably knew like the back of his hand, something went terribly wrong. It was a miserable day, the kind where the rain makes everything look like an old black and white film. The road was slick and visibility wasn't great. What happened next has been debated for years. Some say he was racing a Mercedes 300 SL driven by Rob Walker, a well-known racing team manager and friend. Others reckon it was just a routine drive gone wrong. The Jag lost control, hit a tree, and then collided with another on the opposite side of the road. The impact was catastrophic. You know what's gut-wrenching? Hawthorn had survived countless dangerous races, including the infamous 1955 Le Mans disaster, where he was right in the thick of it. He danced with death at tracks like the old Nürburgring, where one mistake meant game over. Yet here he was, just months after becoming world champion, losing his life on a road far removed from the racetracks he'd spent a career surviving on. The details of the crash are pretty sparse. This was 1959 after all, no CCTV or telemetry data to pore over. We know his Jaguar hit that first tree at speed, probably around 80 miles per hour before bouncing across the road and hitting another. The car's rear wheel had apparently come off, which might explain the initial loss of control, but whether that was cause or effect, we'll never know. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Britain's first Formula One world champion, who'd just retired to avoid the dangers of racing, killed in what should have been a routine journey. Hawthorn's death sent shockwaves through the racing world. His passing left a massive void in British motorsport, just as it was starting to really take off. Think about it. He'd shown that a British driver could beat the mighty Ferrari and Maserati teams at their own game, opening the door for a whole generation of British racers who would go on to dominate F1 in the 1960s and beyond. But his death also sparked important conversations about driver safety, both on and off the track. Racing drivers of that era lived life on the edge. It was part of their DNA, but Hawthorn's accident highlighted how vulnerable they were, even away from the circuit. It's sobering to think that in those days, The drive to and from the track could be just as dangerous as the race itself. He became part of a tragic club, champions who never got to defend their title. He was the first F1 champion to die while holding the crown, a distinction nobody wanted. The sport had lost not just a champion, but one of its most charismatic figures, a guy who epitomized the golden age of motorsport when danger and glory went hand in hand. His legacy lives on, though. That tourist trophy pub in Farnham became a shrine of sorts to British motorsport, where fans and fellow drivers would gather to remember the tall, bow-tied champion who blazed the trail for British success in Formula One. Every British world champion since, from Graham Hill to Lewis Hamilton, owes a little something to that pioneer who proved it could be done. Hawthorn's story represents both the glory and tragedy of motorsport's golden age. His brief reign as champion may have ended tragically, but his achievement as Britain's first F1 world champion opened the door for the wave of British success that would follow. Think about it. Before Hawthorn proved it could be done, British drivers were seen as plucky underdogs in a sport dominated by Italian and German manufacturers. He showed that a Brit could beat Ferrari at their own game, paving the way for legends like Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart. In many ways, the current era of British F1 dominance, from Lewis Hamilton's 7 titles to the rise of teams like McLaren and Williams, can trace its roots back to that breakthrough 1958 championship. His death just months after retiring serves as a poignant reminder of how fragile life was in that era of motorsport. Champions weren't just racing drivers, they were gladiators who danced with danger every time they stepped into the cockpit. Hawthorn embodied that spirit perfectly with his bow tie, his pub, and his devil-may-care attitude. He lived and raced in an age when motorsport still had that romantic, adventurous quality about it, before corporate sponsorship and safety regulations changed the face of F1 forever. So while January 23rd marks a dark day in F1 history, it's also a day to remember a pioneer who changed British motorsport forever. Mike Hawthorn may have left us too soon, but his legacy lives on in every British driver who's stood on top of that podium since. If you enjoyed this story and want more daily content about the highs and lows of Formula One, hit that subscribe button. Until next time.